What happens when a royal guest thinks they can waltz onto one of Britain's most beloved daytime shows and lecture the hosts about their own format? In just 27 seconds, Prince Harry went from charming royal to entitled antagonist, triggering the most explosive meltdown in loose women history that left Jane Moore with no choice but to do the unthinkable. The ITV studios buzzed with anticipation that Tuesday morning. Prince Harry had agreed to appear on Loose Women to discuss his latest charitable endeavors, and the production team was thrilled. This was exactly the kind of high-profile guest that could boost ratings and generate headlines for weeks. Jane Moore sat confidently at the panel desk, her years of experience as both a journalist and television presenter evident in her poised demeanor. To her left sat Nadia Sawalha, whose warm smile masked her sharp wit. Ruth Langsford occupied the chair next to Nadia, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the studio lights as she shuffled through her notes. At the far end, Colleen Nolan completed the formidable quartet, her Liverpudlian accent already evident in her pre-show banter with the crew. "Right, ladies," Jane addressed her fellow panelists during the final commercial break. "Remember, we've got exactly 15 minutes with Harry. The producers want us to keep it light but substantive. Touch on his charity work. Maybe a gentle question about family, but nothing too probing." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "I've prepared some questions about his youth programs. Should be safe territory." Nadia adjusted her microphone. "I'm curious about his perspective on modern parenting, given everything he's experienced." Colleen leaned back in her chair. "Just promise me we won't spend the whole segment tiptoeing around him like he's made of glass. The audience wants authenticity, not a scripted love fest." The floor manager's voice cut through their discussion. 30 seconds to live, ladies. Prince Harry is walking onto set now." Through the studio entrance strode Prince Harry, looking every inch the polished royal, despite his more casual approach to protocol in recent years. He wore a navy blazer over dark jeans, his trademark ginger hair slightly tousled in that carefully calculated way that suggested effortless charm. His smile was broad as he waved to the studio audience. But Jane noticed something in his eyes that seemed different from the Harry she'd interviewed years earlier. "Your Royal Highness." Jane stood to greet him, extending her hand warmly. "Welcome to Loose Women. We're absolutely delighted to have you here." Harry's handshake was firm but brief. "Please, just Harry is fine. Thanks for having me on." As he settled into the guest chair, the familiar Loose Women theme music faded and the opening graphics disappeared from the monitors. Jane turned to camera one with her practiced smile. "Welcome back to Loose Women. I'm Jane Moore, and I'm joined today by Nadia Sawalha, Ruth Langsford, and Colleen Nolan. We're absolutely thrilled to be joined by Prince Harry, who's here to tell us about some exciting charitable projects he's been working on." The audience applauded warmly as Harry waved again, his media training evident in the way he acknowledged their enthusiasm while maintaining eye contact with Jane. "Harry, it's wonderful to see you," Jane continued smoothly. "Before we dive into your charity work, how are you finding life these days? You seem to be keeping incredibly busy." Harry leaned forward slightly, his posture suggesting engagement, but something in his tone carried an edge. "Well, Jane, I have to say, I'm doing really well. But I'm here today because I think it's important that we talk about the work rather than the personal stuff, you know? Too often these interviews become about everything except what actually matters." Jane blinked, momentarily taken aback by his directness. The comment felt like a gentle rebuke, as if he was suggesting she didn't know how to conduct a proper interview. But she was a professional, and she recovered quickly. "Of course, absolutely," she replied diplomatically. "That's exactly why we wanted to have you here. Your work with disadvantaged youth has been remarkable. Can you tell us about the latest initiatives you're launching?" But Harry was already shaking his head, a patronizing smile playing at his lips. "See, this is what I mean. You're framing it as my work when really it should be about the young people themselves. The language we use matters, Jane. It's not about me launching anything. It's about empowering communities to create change from within." Nadia exchanged a subtle glance with Ruth. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted perceptibly. What should have been a straightforward promotional interview was beginning to feel like a lecture. Jane maintained her composure, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're absolutely right, Harry. Perhaps you could tell us about how these communities are creating that change." "Well, that's better," Harry replied, and the condescending tone was unmistakable now. "But even that question assumes they need to be doing something different. Maybe the question should be what we privileged people can learn from them." Ruth decided to jump in, hoping to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "That's a fascinating perspective, Harry. As mothers, I think many of our viewers would be interested in how you approach parenting in the public eye." Harry's expression hardened. Ruth, with respect, that's exactly the kind of question that misses the point entirely. Why are we talking about parenting when there are children going hungry in this country? Why are we focusing on my personal life when there are systemic issues that need addressing? The studio fell silent. Even the audience seemed to sense the tension building between the guest and the panel. Jane felt her professional instincts kick in. She'd interviewed politicians, celebrities, and royals for decades, and she knew when someone was trying to control the narrative inappropriately. "Harry," she said, her voice remaining calm but carrying a new authority, "I appreciate your passion for these causes, but part of what makes you an effective advocate is your personal connection to these issues. Our viewers relate to you as a father, as someone who's experienced loss, as a person navigating challenges. That human element is what makes your advocacy compelling." Harry's eyes flashed with irritation. "Jane, I have to stop you right there. That kind of thinking is exactly what's wrong with the media today. You're more interested in the soap opera than the substance. You want to talk about my personal life because it gets ratings, not because it helps anyone." Colleen had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort, and her Merseyside directness finally broke through. "Hold on there, love. Jane's been doing this job for longer than most people have been breathing. She knows how to connect with an audience, and connection is what drives action. Nobody's trying to exploit you here." Harry turned his attention to Colleen, his expression growing colder. "Colleen, I understand you think you're defending your colleague, but what you're really doing is defending a system that prioritizes entertainment over education. This show has a platform, and with that comes responsibility." The audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Jane felt a familiar surge of protective instinct, not just for herself, but for her colleagues and her show. This wasn't constructive criticism anymore. It was becoming an attack. "Harry," Jane said, her voice carrying a warning tone that regular viewers would recognize, "I think there might be a misunderstanding here about what Loose Women is and what we do. We've been on air for over 20 years because we connect with real women dealing with real issues. We don't talk down to our audience, and we certainly don't lecture them about what they should care about." "But that's exactly my point," Harry pressed on, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension. "You think you're connecting, but you're actually perpetuating a culture where people are more interested in celebrity gossip than in changing the world. Every minute we spend talking about my family is a minute we're not talking about climate change, social justice, mental health resources." Nadia finally spoke up, her usually warm demeanor cooling noticeably. "Harry, with all due respect, you don't get to come on our show and tell us what our show should be about. We cover mental health extensively. We talk about social issues every single day, but we do it in a way that's accessible and relatable to our audience." Harry laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Accessible and relatable. Right. Is that what you call it when you spend 20 minutes discussing what someone wore to an event instead of why that event mattered in the first place?" Ruth bristled visibly. "That's incredibly unfair. Yes, sometimes we talk about fashion or entertainment, but we also discuss domestic violence, financial struggles, parenting challenges, career issues, health scares. We reflect the full spectrum of women's lives, not just the parts you think are important." "The parts I think are important?" Harry's voice rose slightly. "I'm talking about literal life and death issues, children living in poverty, veterans with PTSD, climate refugees. But sure, let's talk about what dress someone wore because that's what really matters to your viewers, right?" The atmosphere in the studio had become genuinely uncomfortable. Camera operators were glancing nervously at their director, unsure whether they should continue filming. The audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what was essentially a royal meltdown on live television. Jane had reached her limit. She'd built her career on asking tough questions while maintaining respect for her guests, but respect was a two-way street. "Harry, I need to say something here. You came on our show as our guest, and we welcomed you warmly. We prepared thoughtful questions about your work, which is exactly what you said you wanted to discuss. But instead of engaging with us respectfully, you've spent the last few minutes insulting our format, our questions, and our audience." "I'm not insulting anyone," Harry shot back defensively. "I'm trying to elevate the conversation. I'm trying to use this platform responsibly." "No," Jane said firmly, her journalist instincts fully engaged now. "You're lecturing. There's a difference between elevating a conversation and talking down to people. Our viewers aren't stupid, Harry. They're intelligent women who can care about multiple things at once. They can support your charities and also enjoy a laugh with us. They can discuss serious issues and also talk about lighter topics. That's not shallow, that's human." Colleen nodded emphatically. "Exactly right, Jane. And frankly, Harry, your attitude is pretty insulting to women in general. You're suggesting we can't handle complexity, that we're too frivolous to understand important issues unless you spell them out for us." Harry's face flushed red. "That's not what I'm saying at all. You're twisting my words." "We're not twisting anything," Nadia interjected sharply. "We're responding to what you've actually said. You've basically told us that our show is worthless, our questions are wrong, and our audience is shallow. How exactly did you expect us to react to that?" The control room was in chaos. Producers were frantically debating whether to cut to a commercial break, while the director kept the cameras rolling, sensing they were capturing television history. The audience remained frozen, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in stunned silence. Harry seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Look, I came here in good faith to discuss important work, and instead I'm being attacked for trying to have a meaningful conversation. This is exactly why public discourse is broken. Nobody wants to engage with substance anymore." Ruth's patience finally snapped completely. "We weren't attacking you, Harry. We were trying to have a conversation. But conversations require listening as well as talking, and you haven't listened to a single thing we've said. You've dismissed us, insulted us, and lectured us from the moment you sat down." "I think," Jane said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been doing this job since before Harry was born, "we need to take a step back here. This conversation has gone completely off the rails, and I don't think it's serving anyone well, including you, Harry." But Harry wasn't finished. "No, Jane, I think we should continue. I think your viewers deserve to see what happens when someone tries to have a real conversation on television. They deserve to see how the media reacts when someone challenges them to do better." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jane Moore, seasoned broadcaster and journalist, recognized the moment for what it was. This wasn't a guest having a bad day or a misunderstanding getting out of hand. This was someone who had come onto her show with an agenda. Someone who thought he could use their platform to make them look foolish while positioning himself as intellectually superior. Jane's expression hardened into something her colleagues recognized but rarely saw. It was the look she got when interviewing politicians who thought they could spin her, when celebrities tried to control the narrative beyond reason. But this was different. This was personal. "Harry," she said, her voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone that regular viewers knew meant trouble, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here. You seem to believe that you can come onto our show and completely rewrite the rules of engagement, that you can insult our format, dismiss our questions, and lecture our audience, all while positioning yourself as some kind of misunderstood truth-teller." Harry opened his mouth to respond, but Jane held up her hand. "I'm not finished. You've spent the last 10 minutes telling us what's wrong with our show, what's wrong with our questions, and what's wrong with our viewers. You've suggested we're frivolous, that we're part of what's broken about media, that we don't understand how to use our platform responsibly." The studio was dead silent now. Even the camera operators had stopped moving, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented in British television history. "But here's what I think really happened," Jane continued, her voice growing stronger. "I think you came here today with a very specific agenda. I think you wanted to use our platform not to genuinely discuss your charity work, but to demonstrate your intellectual superiority over a group of women on daytime television. I think you saw us as an easy target." Harry's face was now genuinely flushed with anger. "That's completely unfair, Jane. I came here to talk about issues that matter." "No," Colleen interjected forcefully. "You came here to lecture us. There's a massive difference, love. And if you can't see that, then you're not as smart as you think you are." Nadia nodded vigorously. "We've had politicians, activists, authors, and experts on this show who've discussed incredibly serious topics without once making us feel stupid or suggesting our format was beneath them. They understood that reaching our audience requires respect, not condescension." Ruth leaned forward, her media training evident in her controlled anger. "What's really disappointing, Harry, is that you had a genuine opportunity here. Our viewers care deeply about the causes you support. But instead of engaging with them respectfully, you've spent your time insulting their intelligence and ours." Harry seemed to realize the situation was spiraling completely out of his control, but his response only made things worse. "This is ridiculous. I'm trying to have an important conversation about serious issues, and you're all making it personal because you can't handle being challenged." The audience finally began to react, with murmurs of disapproval rippling through the studio. These were loose women fans, people who'd been watching Jane Moore and her colleagues for years, and they didn't appreciate seeing their favorite presenters treated this way. Jane stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and commanding. The cameras followed her as she looked directly at Harry, then at the audience, Then back to Harry. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd earned her position through decades of professional excellence. Harry, I need to be very clear about something. This is our show. These are our viewers. This is our format. And it works because we treat our audience with respect and intelligence. We don't talk down to them, and we don't tolerate guests who do either. Harry remained seated, but his posture was defensive now. I never talk down to anyone. I'm trying to elevate the conversation. By telling us our questions are wrong? Jane's voice was razor sharp now. By suggesting our viewers are shallow? By implying that we don't understand how to use our platform responsibly? That's not elevating anything, Harry. That's arrogance. The other panelists watched in fascination as their colleague delivered what was clearly building to something unprecedented. Jane Moore was known for her toughness, but this was different. This was personal. You know what really bothers me about this? Jane continued, beginning to pace slightly behind the desk. It's not just that you've been rude and condescending. It's that you've completely missed the point of what we do here. We connect with millions of women every day because we understand that intelligence and accessibility aren't mutually exclusive. We can discuss mental health and also laugh together. We can support important causes and also enjoy lighter moments. That's not frivolous. That's life. Harry finally stood up, clearly agitated. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're more concerned with defending your format than engaging with the substance of what I'm saying. What substance? Colleen demanded, her Liverpudlian directness cutting through the tension like a knife. You haven't said anything substantive, love. You've just criticized everything we do while offering nothing constructive in return. Nadia was shaking her head in disbelief. I've interviewed world leaders, Harry. I've covered wars and disasters and human rights crises. Don't you dare suggest that I don't understand substance or that I don't care about important issues. Ruth's anger was now barely contained. The arrogance is breathtaking. Absolutely breathtaking. You've been on this show for 15 minutes and you think you understand our audience better than we do? You think you can waltz in here and completely rewrite decades of successful broadcasting? Harry looked around at the four women arrayed against him and seemed to finally grasp the magnitude of his miscalculation. But instead of backing down gracefully, he made one final, fatal error. Fine, he said, his voice rising with frustration. If you can't handle an adult conversation about important issues, then maybe I should just leave. Maybe your viewers deserve better than this kind of defensive reaction when someone tries to challenge them to think bigger. The words hung in the air for a moment, and then Jane Moore did something that would be replayed on social media and news programs for weeks afterward. She smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a media-trained smile, but the cold, professional smile of someone who'd just been handed exactly what they needed. You know what, Harry? She said, her voice now calm and controlled in a way that was somehow more threatening than anger. I think you're absolutely right. I think you should leave. The studio fell into complete silence. Harry stared at her, clearly not expecting this response. Jane continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Because here's the thing about adult conversations. They require mutual respect. They require listening as well as talking. They require treating your hosts and your audience as intelligent human beings, rather than obstacles to your agenda. And you failed on every single count. Harry's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You're actually asking me to leave? I'm not asking, Jane replied firmly. I'm telling you, this interview is over. You're no longer welcome on this set. The audience gasped audibly. In over 20 years of broadcasting, Loose Women had never had a host kick off a guest on live television. But Jane Moore had reached her breaking point, and everyone watching knew they were witnessing television history. Harry looked around desperately, as if seeking support from someone, anyone in the studio. But the crew, the audience, and his fellow guests all stared back at him with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright hostility. This is unbelievable, he muttered, but he was already moving toward the exit, clearly understanding that his position was untenable. Jane followed him with her eyes, her expression never changing. As Harry reached the edge of the set, she delivered her final words with the precision of a surgeon and the impact of a sledgehammer. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Prince Harry, demonstrating exactly why entitlement and arrogance have no place on daytime television. We'll be right back after this break. As the show cut to commercial, the audience erupted in spontaneous applause for Jane Moore and her colleagues. While Harry disappeared through the studio doors, his royal dignity in tatters and his media career forever changed by 27 seconds of pure, unfiltered entitlement that had finally met its match.